the red minivan that haunted us for half a year in 2006. I've shared a few stories on here before, but this is the one that bothers me the most. It happened years ago when I was about 13 or 14. When I was a young teenager back in the fall of 2006, me, my family, and my neighbors started having bizarre encounters with an old man in a dark red minivan. Back then, I used to live on a hill above an old non-operational fishing village. It was about a 40-minute drive outside of the city along a highway. The highway to the village was a dead end. There was nothing down that way except housing. There wasn't even motels or any stores. Most of the houses were homes to elderly people, while the others were abandoned fishing stages that overlooked the water. It was very strange to see anyone that we didn't recognize down in the area, especially from September till May. We would get the odd tourist during the summer months, but never from fall to spring. When I was in middle school, every day after I got home off the bus, I would walk up to the mailbox. It was about a good 15-minute walk along the highway. The mailbox was up the road towards the city. Past my house, there was only about 8 other houses, all on the same side of the road as mine. After those houses, it was just thick trees and marshes. I used to like to call the area Silentville instead of Silent Hill. We were right on the very edge of the East Coast, right by the ocean. It was a fog bank all year round. It was rare we would get sunny days. Even when it was sunny in the city, it was still foggy down there. Sometimes the fog was so thick you barely see a few feet ahead of you. Anyway, one afternoon after school, while I was on my usual trek back home after checking the mailbox, I heard the rattling of a vehicle in the distance. I always walked facing traffic since my mother would have a fit if I didn't. Safety rules and all. It was crawling towards me, its headlights clearing the fog. It was probably going about 5 mph, which was odd considering the speed limit was about 70. The minivan came to a halt about 10 feet ahead of me. Just stopped, right in the middle of the highway. I continued towards it. I figured it was someone looking for directions. As I neared the window of the car, I could see an old man sitting in the driver's seat. He was of a fairly small build, with light gray patches of hair on his head. His eyes were very watery and of a dull blue color. "Hello, young lady," he said in a very soft voice. "Hi," I responded. He started making small chat with me. I really cannot remember what, but it was just sort of casual talking. I noticed he had a small, fluffy white dog in his passenger seat. The thing that really struck me odd about this dog was its body language. You see, this old man would move his hand a lot while talking. Every time he would quickly move it, his dog would sort of scrunch further back in its seat. It seemed a bit afraid of him. Another thing odd was, he always kept his other hand between the 2 seats. I could sort of make out what seemed to be something of a metallic material under his hand. After chatting with me a bit, he slowly turned his head away, then continued up the road towards the city. I shrugged it off, just figuring he was a relative of someone down in the village, and continued home. About a week went by without seeing him, and by then, he was just a memory. I was on my way up to the mailbox when I heard the familiar sound of rattling coming down the roads towards me. Him again, I thought. I was a little weirded out by him, so I jumped down into the ditch and hid in the brush. I watched as he sluggishly drove by. The entire time, he was looking around, observing, sort of like a hunter looking for prey. After he was long out of sight and I couldn't hear his vehicle anymore, I jumped up from the ditch and hurried my way up to the mailbox. The last 6-minute stretch of road had no housing, so it was pretty isolated. After snatching up the mail, I started hurrying back, and that is when I ran into him again, in the worst place possible, the long stretch with no houses. This time, he was coming up the road quite fast. I didn't have time to hide. He pulled up next to me and said, "Hello, dearie. Why were you down in the ditch earlier?" Oh shit, I thought. He had seen me. "Oh, I thought I had seen a cat down there," I said. "You like cute animals, dearie? You can get in the back seat and play with my puppy. She loves kids," he said, smiling. "Hey, no thanks," I said as I started to walk away. He reached out of his window and grabbed my arm. "Please, dearie," I insist. "I can drive you home. You live at my address, right?" I stood there dumbfounded. How did he know which house I lived in? I shook him off and started to run. He started backing his car up after me. I bolted down the road and didn't look back. At the time, my aunt lived a few houses up the road from my house, so I ran into her driveway and started frantically banging on her door. She came to the door and let me in. I used her phone and called my mother to come pick me up. After we got home, I told her everything. She was very upset and called the police. They basically told us they couldn't do anything, especially since we didn't have a license plate number. After that, I wasn't allowed to go on walks. He continued to show up. Usually twice a week, right after my school bus dropped me off, he would come driving slowly down the road. One day my neighbor asked him what he was doing. He responded, "Oh, I'm just a lonely gentleman. I saw a woman one day down the road working on her garden, and she just captured my heart." My neighbor told him she was married. He just laughed and said something along the lines of, "If you want love to work, you have to work for it," then drove off. My neighbor got the license plate and called the police. About 40 minutes later, the police came down, but he was long gone by then. Our neighbor waved the police over and talked to them. They told him the car had been reported stolen a few months back. Sometime during November, my parents were out in the evening doing yard work. He stopped in front of our yard and was asking my parents where I was. He said he missed our time together and felt neglected. My parents got really upset and chased him away. A few days later, I was up late at night playing Foxy on the Xbox 360 in the den. The den was on the bottom floor. I used to keep all the blinds open with the lights off in the room. I liked looking at the night sky. People could probably see me through the window since it was facing the street. So there I was, illuminated by the TV, all cuddled up in my big armchair having a late-night game session, probably about 2 AM, and I see the familiar red minivan slowly coming down the road. I froze. It parked a few feet up the road from my property, in between our house and the house next door. There was a small driveway that led to nowhere, going in between our land. He stopped his car, turned it off, then came out. I watched in horror as he walked closer to our house. I was terrified. I pushed myself as far back into the chair as I could, hoping he wouldn't see me. I felt like screaming, but my parents were upstairs, and both were sound sleepers. He paced back and forth in front of our house, sort of staring. He was looking into the den. Now, this is the extremely strange part. He just stopped in place, then laid down on the side of the road in front of our house. He just laid there for a good hour. I was frozen with fear the entire time. After about an hour, he got up, then strolled back to his car and left. I ran upstairs crying and told my parents. They called the police again, but he was gone by the time they got to us. We were all frustrated. The police, despite having his license plate, couldn't do anything, and this guy was coming around harassing and terrifying us and our neighbors. This went on till about March. About a month passed without seeing him. And that is when we got the news. Our neighbor, who was good friends with someone that lived down a dead-end side road up a bit further, had been on a walk to his friend's house. He spotted the red minivan off in a driveway of a house that had just been put up for sale. The people were moved out. He got filled with anger when seeing it and ran over. When he got closer, he noticed blood on the passenger side window. He went to the closest house and used their phone to call 911. He went back over to the car to check it out. He was pretty ballsy. He was sort of the neighborhood protector. The car doors were unlocked. He looked in the window to see the small dog's body, a wallet, which had an ID in it, and a bloody wrench wedged between the 2 seats. He left and waited for the police to arrive. Our neighbor stayed in contact with the police. Apparently, the guy had left in a hurry, leaving his ID behind. Turns out he had just been released from prison not too long ago for offenses towards minors. We didn't get any details, though. I felt so horrible for the dog. I really hope he never got his hands on another animal again. I sometimes worry that he went on to harass other people the same way he harassed us.